It's Wednesday, April 13th. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. And on Sunday, the 3rd of April, the media reported out of Malaysia that a 737 dropped 7,000 feet in seconds, causing passengers to float in their seats. The data suggests something different. Let's take a look. Here from Simple Flying, they picked up the story from the New Straits Times. According to the report in the New Straits Times, Malaysia Airlines flight 2664 was 30 minutes into the flight when the incident occurred. A passenger on board later said on social media the plane dived 7,000 feet in a matter of seconds, causing several passengers to float off of their seats. Well, let's go see what actually happened. Over here on Simon Radecki's Aviation Herald, incident Malaysia Boeing 737-800. This is an NG. This is not a 737 MAX. Near Kuala Lumpur on 3 April 2022, Pitot static system failure caused upset. A Malaysian Airlines Boeing 737-800, that's an NG, not a MAX, performing flight as MH2664 from Kuala Lumpur to Tuwau, was en route at 30,000 feet, about 110 nautical miles east of Kuala Lumpur, already over the coast of Malaysia to the South China Sea, when the aircraft pitched up with the autopilot disconnecting due to a wrong airspeed indication. The crew counteracted to maintain control of the aircraft. The aircraft subsequently performed a controlled descent to 13,000 feet, flight level 130 in that part of the world, leveling off at flight level 130 15 minutes after leaving flight level 300, averaging 1,130 foot per minute rate of descent, a nice, gradual, normal rate of descent, and returned to Kuala Lumpur for a safe landing about 2 hours after departure. Passengers told Malaysian media initially that the aircraft had been in turbulence at 310 when it suddenly, within seconds, lost 7,000 feet to flight level 240, causing them to float out of their seats and to fear for their lives. That narrative was clearly disproven by the radar data. We'll take a look at that in a minute. While the air return indicated that there had indeed been some sort of a problem. In a media statement on 10 April 2022, the Civil Aviation Authority of Malaysia reported that both the CVR and FDR, that's the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder of the aircraft, had been secured and had been analyzed. Based on the FDR data, a malfunction of the pitot static system was discovered that caused erratic speed indications, prompting the autopilot to disconnect and the aircraft to substantially pitch up. So the autopilot disconnected. If the aircraft gets unreliable airspeed indications and starts trying to trim for that, if you get the aircraft so far out of trim, the autopilot will suddenly disconnect and the aircraft will be in a pretty severely out of trim state. Remember, when you get unusual airspeed indications, the first thing to do is click, 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 turn off all the automation and set a known pitch and power setting. In this case, the crew caught it late and the autopilot gave up on the crew, or at least according to this report, before the crew took action. Once the autopilot kicked off, the crew was forced to take action. The crew reacted correctly, pitching the aircraft down. An abrupt input from the flight crew was seen on the flight data recorder, so that's where the passengers are feeling the actual float out of their seats. These maneuvers correspond with the pilot post-flight reports as well as with some of the passenger experiences. These maneuvers were compounded by bad weather, which caused passenger discomfort in the cabin. A lot of turbulence. If you get in a very heavy turbulence, I dare call it extreme turbulence, that too may kick off the autopilot. The autopilot cannot keep up if it gets really, really turbulent. But in this case, it sounds like a case of inaccurate airspeed indications, unreliable airspeed indications, caused by a problem with the Pitot system. We'll talk about that in a minute. The initial actions taken by the crew, as well as the execution of the abnormal recovery checklist as per standard operating procedures, were sufficient based on the initial investigation results. Malaysia Airlines completed a review of the Pitot static system, including Pitot heating on their fleet. The occurrence aircraft remains currently grounded pending review by Boeing. Did this Pitot static system freeze up in the bad weather? The kind of thunderstorm activity you can get in that part of the world can be very extreme and can result in some pretty extreme icing conditions. Was the Pitot heat, or probe heat as it's called in the NG, 737 NG, working correctly? So let's go to Flight Radar 24 and look at the preliminary ADS-B data. Here you can see the aircraft got about this far out. Well, let's see exactly where the incident occurred, but they ended up turning around, coming back, descending, and then holding a little while before coming in to land. So if we look at the ground speed and altitude graph, it looks like right about in here, right about here is where they had the unreliable airspeed indication problem and the autopilot temporarily kicking off. It looks like they got the autopilot back on and then subsequently elected to turn around and go back to their arrival airport, commencing a normal rate of descent here, holding, and then back in for landing. So let's take a closer look at this data right here. The blue being the altitude, the yellow being the ground speed. They're steady at 25,000 feet, airspeed 426 knots. And then the airspeed picks up to 450 knots and then drops off suddenly to 358 knots, at which time the altitude only changed a little less than 2,000 feet. And they recovered the aircraft and got the aircraft back on altitude, probably hand flying the aircraft at this point. And then eventually getting the autopilot back on and then electing to return back to the airport. So the initial upset resulted in an altitude loss of less than 2,000 feet, but that's where the passengers felt light in their seats. That, coupled with turbulence, can be alarming as a passenger. The probe heat on the 737 NG is controlled on the overhead panel right here below the window heat. Probe heat A and B off and on, and if the probe heat was left in the off position, you would get a yellow light indication right here, as I assume a master caution warning as well on board the aircraft. But these switches are normally turned on during the pre-flight of the aircraft and left on for the entirety of the flight. This is something about continuing to run the 737 design all the way into the MAX. Now, again, this is a 737 NG. This is not a MAX, but in order to keep a common type certificate rating, the 737 series of aircraft has to keep this rather antiquated overhead panel to the 737, as otherwise on more modern designs, all this is automated. Like, for example, on the Boeing 777 and on Airbus designs, there's no turning on or off of the probe heat. It's absolutely idiot proof. It's just on all the time and taken care of automatically. But in the old 737, you still got the switches to turn them on and off. Again, to meet a common type certificate rating requirement by the FAA. Here's a good comparison of the classic 737 Pitot static switches here on the right compared to the probe heat on the NG or later series of 737 on the left. Same thing but different. Here's a good picture of the Pitot tube system on various models of the 737 from the 737 Technical Site UK. Up here, upper right, is the NG. There's a Pitot tube. Here is a angle of attack indicator, and here is a total air temperature probe, all of which are heated. Here on the 737 MAX, a Pitot tube, I believe that's the total air temperature probe, and an angle of attack indicator. And over here is shown the more classic 737s, the 3, 4, and 500 series, 2 Pitot tubes, a angle of attack indicator, and a total air temperature probe right here. So third world pro tips on these tubes. First, make sure the pitot covers are removed. These things are covered with little covers and with a canvas red flag removed before flight to keep the bugs out of them when the aircraft are parked, if they're parked for any length of time. Number 2, these things are hot. Pitot is hot, as my friends in the Navy learned. These things are heated and can be very hot on the ground. Number 3, do not use these things as a ladder or a step getting up and down the aircraft to wash the captain's window. These are very delicate instruments. Number 4, if you slam into this thing with the jet bridge, the jet is out of service immediately. These, again, are very delicate instruments. And number 5, if you have a problem with one of these probes or angle of attack indicators, you just can't throw any old probe or angle of attack indicator on there and call it good to go. You have to have the exact right part and part number, and the system needs to be very carefully calibrated before it is returned to flight. Here's the other end of the system, the static ports that are located further down along the fuselage, which need to remain clear, no tape over it, and if any damage is done inside this black circle area, that aircraft is out of service. Malaysia Airlines has had a problem with this once before on a Airbus A330 out of Australia. The Australian Transportation Safety Bureau has completed a very thorough accident investigation on this, where the crews left the pitot covers on the pitot tubes when they went to take off. This report, look for this on Mentor Pilot. Me and Petter talked about this, and he's going to do an excellent review of this entire report with all of his good graphics over there on the Mentor Pilot channel. So look for that hopefully soon from Petter, the complete report on what happened to Malaysia Airlines and how was it that the ball was dropped that these streamers were left on the pitot tubes when this aircraft departed, causing unreliable airspeed indications. A very, very dangerous situation and a tricky emergency to handle. So good job, Malaysia Airlines, getting this 737 back on the ground safely. It did not drop 7,000 feet within seconds. It dropped less than 2,000 feet within a fairly short period of time. Passengers did get a little float in their seats. The weather was turbulent and bumpy, but unreliable airspeed indications can be a very dangerous situation that pilots need to be properly trained for and to handle. Click, 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 turn the autopilot, auto throttles off, hand fly the aircraft, establishing a known pitch and power setting to keep the aircraft under control. Thank you so much for your support, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. We'll see you here. Stories like these, where the reports in the media are so much different than the actual data suggests, is a great lead into this new book by Dr. David P. Pitot. He reached out to me, and I've got yours truly is featured in this book on page 41, a 3-page vignette about the reporting of the Oroville spillway fiasco by the Blanco Lirio channel. How we receive our information today during chaotic times is the context of this book, and it's just loaded with vignettes about how we receive our information during these days of high-speed information moving around, especially on social media. How do you separate, as I say, the fly doo-doo from the pepper? So check it out, Velocity of Information, David P. Pitot.